Good afternoon. We are here just after a very optimist outlook about shipping and several comments of optimism about interconnectivity in our region. Now we are shifting to banking and finance territory. George Frazis, active in bank and finance, advisor on debt capital markets, and coming from down under, from Australia, a Greek Australian of second generation. I wonder whether he'll bring to us the same kind of optimism as we've had. I know that he tracks things Greek, and he knows that we have been out of the ringer from the 10 years, more than 10 years of financial and fiscal crisis. He comes from a younger nation, far more dynamic. So how about banking trends and economic development? How do the two mingle together in a forward-looking way from a crisis-stricken land as Greece used to be, and the recovering one as we hope it is? Should.
Antonis, firstly, it's great to be here, so thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation. I'll have to start by saying I'm also an optimist, but having said that, the optimism is not about just going forward and thinking everything will be all right. The optimism is all about saying, look, if actually people agree there's a problem and the right people get around the room, then they can actually solve that problem and move forward. And it's exactly what we've seen Greece achieved over the last 10 years. And it's huge congratulations to the governments and the people of Greece in terms of what has been achieved. If I kind of just touch on the banking side, because people talk about innovation in banking, to be frank, probably the most critical innovation of banking, which I don't want to spend too much time on, has been mobile banking, because what that has done is really provided access to banking to an extra billion people around the world. So it really has made a big difference. The thing about banking is, if you think about economic development, which is critical to self-determination, to having a job, to being able to look after your family, etc. Now that requires economic development. Economic development does require capital, and the cheapest form of capital is bank debt. So it is important that each country has a stable and strong banking system, but it's also important that banking system supports economic growth. And those two things at times can go against each other, and they need to be balanced.
But when you've been burned through, risk-taking, maybe through inordinately high risk-taking, as we had in Greece, and then you are put in a kind of straitjacket, how do you get out? George Frazis happens to be an engineer by training. I'm a lawyer by training, so the difference may be evident. I think that the rules are there to be obeyed, but when you obey too many rules, you cannot open up to new things happening.
Yeah, that's right. And the thing with rules is you've got to really think through the impact a rule has on behaviour as well, not just kind of the letter of the rule. And I'll touch on that in a second. The starting point is there is no doubt Greece had to deal with its non-performing loans. And I'll have to say it's done a remarkable job to reduce those between 6 to 7%. Now that job's not over. We probably still need to aim for something under 3%, but actually the heavy lifting has been done. The challenge you've got, as you state, Antonis, is when you think about regulators, the Bank of Greece, the banking system in itself, when you've gone through that mentality of having to fix non-performing loans, it's difficult to put yourself back into a growth mindset that says, hey, we're here to support companies to grow, and we actually have to lend. And if I look at the lending growth in Greece, it's actually a reasonable 2.5% growth rate. And in fact, if you take out government entities, that's at 3.6. But the reality is we should be targeting something double that to really stimulate growth and support the agenda that the government has and what's required to actually improve unemployment further.
you come here all the way from Australia. May I ask a rather shallow question? Does Greece, not to you who are a Greek Australian, but does Greece exist in the map when seeing from Sydney or from Canberra or from wherever?
Greece definitely exists. But I suppose a key element of that is the Greek migrants that have had a real impact on the culture of Australia. And there's something like the last census. There's close to 500,000 people in in Australia that actually state they've got some connection with Greece, right? And feel Greek. I'll have to say, personally, I absolutely feel Greek, even though I'm an Australian born in Australia. I've been visiting Greece every year for decades now. And I'm really proud of what Greece has given to the world more generally, but also really proud of the transition and actually the change that's occurred over the last 10 years, because and it has been a really incredible change. Now, so those links are still very strong.
But also, speaking from Australia, meaning somewhere south of the Indo-Pacific, as we learn to read the map as of lately, does really Europe exist in Australia? Most of Australians are of European descent, but does Europe, not as a nice place with very nice museums, quite good wine, even good cheeses, but does Europe exist as a cultural plus economic entity?
That's a really good question. If I take an Australian perspective on that, our strongest defence link is with the US. It's a very strong link. It's been there for most of this century, and it really makes a difference to our security. Now, we can't be complacent, by the way, and in fact, Australia now has increased its defence spending. We're spending in the order of 16 billion on defence, and we've just, as you know, bought some nuclear submarines, which is going to cost about 50 billion over the next 10 years. So actually the military connection is with the US. Our trade, however, is linked with China, and I know China is an important trading partner for Greece, but for us, it represents a third of our trade. 300 billion plus in terms of trade, US is with China. So it's a very interesting balancing act in the sense that, our alliance with defence and culturally how we feel about ourselves is more US based, and now with the UK, with the AUKUS, still with the submarines, but basically the trade is with China. Now that's required some really intelligent and careful dialogue and how we actually deal with China. And in fact, there are many things that we disagree on, and one of them is maritime rights, which is a real hot issue for Australia at the moment. As you know, China and Philippines are having a dispute, the South China Sea. Now, Australia is actually conducting joint patrols with the Philippines in support of the law of the maritime law in that sense.
George brought the notion of China, the weight of China, the presence of China, on his own volition in our discussion. So I can't really resist the temptation and ask him, is there a feeling of threat in Australia and New Zealand, in the region, of threat out of an expanding and more powerful and potentially bellicose China, or trade links will carry the day? We speak from Greece, which is not in the same kind of position, but it's quite clear to fronts, to real war fronts. I'm thinking of the Ukraine, and I can't even bear to think of Gaza. But how is the climate down under? What I want to kind of distinguish is between the Chinese people and the Chinese government for a start, because basically we've had Chinese migrants to Australia,
for as long as we've had migration in Australia. And in fact, I grew up in Darwin, where basically it was Greek migrants and Chinese migrants. So there's very strong kind of cultural connections in that sense. They've got family values, they work hard and all of that stuff. Now,
is there any kind of interconnection between migrants of the two cultures?
Absolutely, they do kind of relate in that sense. So it kind of shows that that's why dialogue, face-to-face dialogue, is so important. Now, that's different to the communist government and its policies and its more outward look that we've got at the moment. And there's no doubt that the environment has definitely heated up. What that's meant from Australia's perspective is the alliances, the AUKUS alliance is a really important one with the US and the UK. That really is kind of starting to, there's the Five Eyes agreement which shares intelligence with those 5 nations. There's a number of those things are really important when it comes to defence, and that has actually increased in its, what I would say, heat. It also has meant that Australia has had to increase its spending on defence, which I think is the right thing. But trade is really important. So kind of trade increases the cost of something occurring at the end of the day, right? There is an economic element to this.
It goes on as a disincentive for
absolutely.
Too much trouble to occur.
But you can't just rely on trade, but because trade is there, I think it does change the picture, and it does mean that it enables you to have a reason for a dialogue. Now, it's all about kind of agreeing to disagree where you do disagree, but also making sure you find common ground.
You're in banking. Would you feel happy if an Australian company comes to you and says that I have to make an investment just over in China? Would you feel comfortable with that, or would you tend to say, well, can't we choose another venue for this?
No, I think trade should be encouraged, is my view, because the more trade you have, and going back to your other question is, I think the trade between Australia and Europe can be increased and improved, and particularly the trade between Australia and Greece can be increased, particularly when you look at the social links. So trade is really important. You've got to distinguish between strategic assets, however, from your general trade.
So you wouldn't really like to have a second or a third port of Chinese ownership? Well,
Greece and Australia have something in common. So basically, the Darwin port where I come from has been bought by a Chinese entity, and I know the Piraeus port is in a similar issue. I mean, personally, I'm not here to make comment on those, but I would say ports are a strategic asset which maybe, should be kept state-owned, would be my sense. And, as a telco engineer, there's absolutely no doubt things like 5G and how we think about that is a really important strategic asset as well.
So there you would be more cautious?
Absolutely. I would be personally, yes.
A final, an exit question, as they say in television. Overall optimist or wary about the next, let's say, 5 years in your region of the world?
I would say still an optimist, but a waring optimist.
A waring optimist.
Yes, in the sense that I don't think we should take peace for granted, and I think we should be really clear on what the law is, and also make sure that we're aligned with countries supporting that law to make sure that basically borders are respected, etc. So now, having said that, economically, I think I'm an optimist. I think it's important to continue that trade growth, but at the same time, we do need to think about defence, etc.
So, George, thanks indeed,
Antonis,
even for the bit of optimism as the final reply to a non-question. And we've been really happy to host this debate with you.
It's fantastic. Okay? Thanks, Antonis. Thank you.